I'm Ann Dart.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome.
If you enjoy our show, please consider contributing to the Dark and Stormy Patreon. By becoming a patron, you will help us create better and quality content. There are also benefits to becoming a patron, such as exclusive content and Dark and Stormy merchandise. Become a supporter at patreon.com/darkandstormybc. Check our website for the link. We appreciate any and all contributions. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to episode 138 of Dark and Stormy Book Club. Today we visit with author Susan Spann, all the way from Japan.
Susan Spann began reading precociously and voraciously from her preschool days in Santa Monica, California. As a child, read everything from National Geographic to Agatha Christie. In high school, she once turned a short story assignment into a full-length fantasy novel, which, fortunately, will never see the light of day. A yearning to experience different cultures sent Susan to Tufts University in Boston, where she immersed herself in the history and culture of China and Japan. After earning an undergraduate degree in Asian studies, Susan diverted to law school. She returned to California to practice law, where her continuing love of books has led her to specialize in intellectual property, business, and publishing contracts. Susan's interest in Japanese history, martial arts, and mystery inspired her to write the Shinobi mystery series featuring Hiro Hattori, a 16th century ninja who brings murderers to justice with the help of Father Mateo, a Portuguese Jesuit priest. Ghost of the Bamboo Road is the 7th in the Shinobi mystery series. It's January 1566. When a vengeful spirit terrorizes a mountain village, Hiro and Father Mateo must save the villagers from the phantom's wrath. En route to Edo, Master Ninja Hiro Hattori and Portuguese Jesuit Father Mateo spend the night in a rural mountain village whose inhabitants live in terror of a legendary vengeful ghost. When the innkeeper's mother is murdered and Father Mateo's housekeeper Anna is blamed for a crime she did not commit, Hiro and Father Mateo are forced to investigate and reveal the truth. But when another woman turns up murdered in the snow, the detectives must face the shocking truth that the vengeful Yore the villagers fear might be more than just a legend.
We would like to welcome Susan Spann to the program. She is the author of fascinating mystery, Ghost of the Bamboo Road. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Ghost of the Bamboo Road is a complex mystery with a base in superstition. How prevalent was superstition in Japanese culture in the 1500s, and has that changed?
Japan has a fantastic set of superstitions. In fact, there is a superstition for just about everything here. It's a lot like a lot of old wisdom that you would find in, I think, just about any culture, right? We all have our superstitions. Japan has, in particular, a highly developed ghost lore, and this was always fascinating to me. Japan has a ghost for everything, and they have a special ghost for everything. Like, for example, there's apparently a Japanese ghost that inhabits bathrooms, and has for a long time. Now, I'm not sure what it does in there, but, there's a bathroom ghost, and it surprises people and it scares people. There's also a ghost called Beto Beto-san that supposedly sounds like clogs on a cobblestone road, which is the sound beto, 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 beto. That's the onomatopoeia for the sound that clogs make. And this ghost follows people at night, and it follows you trying to scare you. And according to Japanese lore, if you turn around and say, "Oh, after you, sir," the ghost will go on by and will never bother you again, because it's a trickster and it only wants to scare you. So things like this just exist all throughout Japanese legend and Japanese history. It was very, very prevalent during the 16th century. People didn't just consider them superstitions. They actually believed in a lot of these things. And so that's one thing that I love to play with in the novels are some of these really fascinating cultural beliefs. It helps that I have a shinobi or a ninja as my main character, my detective, who is much more pragmatic and kind of looks at these things sideways and says, "Oh, I'm not really sure I believe that." And I think that people did that in the past as well. I think obviously, like today, there were some people who believed in superstition and there were people who didn't. That's sort of the same in the modern day. I think a lot fewer people are superstitious today. But there certainly are still some superstitions, some things that people do. For example, there's a very popular holiday called Setsubun. It takes place at the beginning of spring, February 2nd normally, when people throw roasted soybeans and cry, "Oni out." Oni meaning demon. So it's an idea of chasing away the demons. Now, do people actually believe that throwing soybeans into the air will scare demons? I think about the same way that people actually believe that Punxsutawney Phil can predict 6 more weeks of winter.
Hiro, he is a great character. He can change from a warrior into a caring, humble servant in a blink of an eye. He changed my whole idea of what a ninja does. Was there an actual person that you based him on?
Hiro is actually an amalgamation of real historical ninjas. Shinobi, of course, being the Japanese word, but ninja being the word that we use in English. It's based on a Chinese reading of those same Japanese characters. Shinobi were actually very surprising. I learned about them when I was in college at Tufts University. I studied Asian studies, and one of the things that was most fascinating to me were the differences between history and perception, popular perception in particular. Ninjas were actually espionage agents, and they had highly developed systems for espionage. And so we think of them the way that the movies have shown them to us, which is sort of these like superheroes in the black pajamas who run around and do all kinds of cool things. And the reality was actually even cooler. They not only had a bunch of those tools, they could climb walls, they used smoke bombs, they used fighting claws, which were mostly a women's weapon, actually. A lot of people don't even realize there were female ninjas. They were called kunoichi, and they were very, very successful at what they did. Ninjas were also masters of disguise, and they were intelligence agents. And so one of the things that I really wanted for Hiro was to portray what a real ninja might have actually been like during that period.
I loved how your books, even though they're mysteries, included a touch of humor. I especially liked the character of Saku. How difficult is it to find appropriate humor in such a distant past?
I think humor is all around us, both then and now. I think sometimes you have to work a little harder to find it, but it's so worthwhile when you do. I love to laugh. I think that readers love to laugh. Seems to be correct. So I like finding things that we can look at and find funny and maybe make those connections, because I think that people find certain things funny universally. And so a little bit in the book, what I'm doing is kind of exploring those topics of humor that are evergreen. I make it a point to seek out the kinds of things that not only are funny still, but would have been funny to people in that time. So it's something that I really enjoy.
This is the first of your books that I've read, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I especially appreciated your addition of the glossary in the back with the Japanese terms that I would not have understood otherwise. What inspires you to set your story in a certain place or with an event?
For me, I have a series arc. So I sort of know where my characters are going to go, but it's loose so that they can go to different places. And one of the things that I love doing in these books, in addition to sharing what I hope are good and page-turning stories, is being able to share really cool places in Japan. Because, of course, if you're going to set a story in a place that is so distant from the place where you grew up, and I do live in Japan now, but I didn't originally, then one thing that's really neat is you can go anywhere. And that also, of course, means that I get to physically go there, because I physically go to all of the places that my books are set in so that I can look at the geography and make sure that it works and walk through houses. There are some preserved houses from these eras. So I can actually go in. For example, every building that you see in my books is based on a real building that I've seen, that I've walked through, that I've looked at. Creates sort of a verisimilitude, I hope, in the books. And so what inspires me is I find really neat places in Japanese history that maybe people don't know quite so much about, at least in the States. And then I go there and I try and figure out what kind of a crime might have actually happened there. So, for example, Ghost of the Bamboo Road is set in an area called Hakone, which is a very popular onsen or hot spring resort. It has a lot of mountains. I've done a lot of hiking there, and it's really mountainous. It sat on a travel road that used to be called the Tokaido, and before that, there was an older road called the Yusakamichi, which is actually the road that Ghost of the Bamboo Road is set on. And curiously, I found out, doing my research, that along about that time, the road was shifting. The old Yusakamichi was falling into disuse. And the new road, which would become known as the Tokaido, which followed a slightly different path, was beginning to be more popular, especially because of landslides and other things that would happen in the winter and then typhoon season. These travel roads supported whole towns and villages of people who worked as porters and gave inns and tea houses. And I thought, what would happen to a town that started to become isolated by a change in the travel road, when the travel road was its very reason for existence? In a sense, those towns would start to die. They would almost become ghosts themselves. And so I was playing with that duality in this book. That was what inspired this one in particular.
In The Ghosts of the Bamboo Road, you talked about this a little earlier, you hint of the intense discipline and training of ninjas. Have these practices changed or evolved since the 16th century?
Well, in many ways, both yes and no. Many people would tell you there are no ninjas today, and of course that's true in the historical sense. We don't still have Japanese assassins running around doing the things that they did as espionage agents. The height of the real ninja activity actually was the 16th century. It was a very tumultuous time. These trainings had been passed down from father to son and head of the clan to next succeeding head of the clan for centuries. And they had really reached their apex at around this point in the 16th century, which is part of the reason that I set my books here. Today, mostly the Shinobi teachings are preserved. There are some wonderful authors who have translated a bunch of these. There's a man named Anthony Cummins who has translated a bunch of the ninja scrolls, published books on it. So if any people are interested in reading about that, I suggest that you check out his books. He translates the original teachings. And so there are schools that still preserve the teachings of the various Shinobi schools. People who are practitioners of those arts now. It is more as a historical discipline as opposed to an active form of training.
The ideas of entertainers in the tea house experience was very interesting. Can you explain why they were such an integral part of the tea house experience, and do they still have entertainers?
They do at certain kinds of tea houses still to this day. The tea houses in Japan are very interesting, and I could talk at length about tea house culture because it's just fascinating to me. I have actually had a professional level seminar in tea ceremony, which is different from going to a tea house. So there are many different branches of tea and tea drinking in Japan. The tea houses that appear in the book are a kind where people would go for food or to drink tea, sometimes to drink sake as well, and to entertain. They were basically clubs almost, because you would go to the same one, or there would be some on the travel roads where people could go and anybody would go there. And the ones in the larger cities tended to be fairly stable in terms of their clientele. So a samurai would find a tea house that he liked and he would go to it, or a merchant would find a tea house that he liked and he would go to it regularly. The entertainers were there basically to provide conversation. There's a large misperception, especially in the West, that geisha or entertainers were prostitutes, which they were not. In fact, many times, while a geisha might have accepted a single patron, and that was a very, very expensive undertaking for the patron, who would have access to certain favors, for the most part, geisha were not supposed to be sexually involved with their clients or to have any kind of inappropriate relationship beyond conversation and singing and dancing in the tea house, because they were almost considered to be a feminine ideal. And so they were supposed to be sort of beyond being able to be touched for most people. The idea of having them in the tea house really was to provide a place where men generally could go and could have conversation on any topic. Geisha were supposed to be very intelligent. They were supposed to know about the politics of the day. They were supposed to know poetry. They could recite poetry. They read widely, and they were accomplished musicians and dancers. And so these were actually very, very accomplished professional women in the sense that they were highly skilled at what they did. And their presence in a tea house could actually raise the level of a tea house from just being a small place where people would go to spend a few coins to the kind of place where people would spend just almost years and years worth of salary over the course of several years.
Now, when Anna, or the maid, was put in locked confinement because they thought she stole some of the silver, was that a common thing back then where you would have to pay for your servant's release by paying what they thought they stole?
There was always an idea of responsibility in Japan. And so not only your servant, but anyone who was your retainer. The samurai generals would have men who worked for them, who would then in turn have men who worked for them. The idea was that if anyone that you were responsible for in any way committed a crime, you also carried responsibility for that crime. you would be expected to either make compensation or sometimes even bear the penalty on their behalf. So it was not uncommon if a person committed a very serious crime. For example, in Edo, which is now called Tokyo at the time, allowing your building to burn down was a capital crime. To a certain extent, if the rest of the family should have done something about it, they even could be held responsible. So yes, this idea of